I am an African.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Africa for Dummies. I hope you're all doing well. Today we have another great show for you, and joined by the co-host with the most, Zengi. Zengi, how you doing, bro?
I'm good. How's everyone doing? Thank you for keeping listening.
Yeah, it's really great to be back. If you guys haven't had the opportunity, please be sure to check out our recent documentary, which follows the journey of a freedom fighter who from Zambia, who experienced various different things within across the continent in total. And as usual, we have a really great guest today with a really great topic regarding Africa and the church. For some people, Christianity is this amazing religion that brings them closer to others. Christianity is a religion that was a pathway for colonialism to come into the continent. And today we have an amazing guest who is able to shed light on this topic, whether certain claims are true or not. His name is Pastor Femi Osunnuyi. Hopefully I didn't butcher that. He is the lead pastor of City Church, Lagos, Nigeria, and he's also passionate about church planting, and he's also a contributor to the Gospel Coalition.org. Pastor Femi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey guys, thank you for having me, and I look forward to this conversation. I really like what you guys are doing. I've been able to just skim through the podcast, but anything Pan-African actually scratches an itch of mine. So it's nice to see, you guys really doing this with your generation, and I think we need more of that. So well done.
Thank you very much. So just to dive right into the topic, because I discovered you from an article that you wrote at the Gospel Coalition, which was diving into the topic of whether Christianity in Africa was colonialism. So just for people to maybe you can just elaborate a little bit, would you say that the existence of Christianity in Africa is a result of colonialism?
Short answer is no, and that's sort of what I argue for in the piece with the Gospel Coalition. And I'm not the only one saying that. I just think, So I just think it's a piece that just needs to be told a little bit more, because the implications for us thinking about Christianity being as a result of colonialism, particularly Christianity in Africa. I think the narrative, and I grew up with this narrative as well, so that, the European missionaries came sometime in the 18th century, not in the 18th, the 19th century to early 20th century. There was some Catholic activity with the Portuguese, right about the 15th century, but that didn't achieve as much, at least Africa-wide, maybe a lot more in Angola and those parts. But the vast majority of people would say that Christianity came from the 18th, 19th century on the wheels of colonialism. Now, this isn't trying. If you just give me a few minutes to just back it up a little bit, I can speak just from the Bible. So obviously, I'm a Christian, and the Bible is really important. But I do think, not even just speaking as a Christian, the Bible is also a historical record, right? Eyewitness accounts and things like that. So if you take the Bible, six books of the Bible are divided into two major parts, or one called the Old Testament and the other one called the New Testament. And they're both telling the story of God, the one God, revealing himself to his people. Now, what you find is that there's a people of the Old Testament and there's people of the New Testament. But I'm not telling the theological story there. I just want to tell you a little bit of the history. Now, in the Old Testament, what you have there is God's people, Israel, and it tells you about how Israel is formed as a nation. And Israel is formed first and foremost by God calling a man called Abraham. Abraham is revered among the three monotheistic religions. Now, Abraham has a son, Isaac. Isaac has a son, has two sons, Jacob, and the story is that Israel forms from Jacob's 12 sons. The nation of Israel forms from Jacob's 12 sons, so there are 12 tribes. Now, one of them, the most famous of them, and the one that's written the most about, is a guy called Joseph. And Joseph somehow was sold by his brothers, and eventually was sold to Egypt, i.e., Egypt in Africa. And then the story is that he eventually starts as a slave and eventually rises to the place of prominence, like the prime minister, second in command to Pharaoh. Now, his daughter, Pharaoh gave him a wife that was the daughter of a priest, an Egyptian priest. And then Joseph had two sons. And because of Joseph's prominence in Israel, he's given two tribes. The name of his two sons, the two sons now become two tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim. I want to think about that. That means already very early in the story of the people of God, you have Africa within that. Second is all the activity that happens that we know that eventually after that, 400 after that, years after that, Moses, the guy was the deliverer of Israel from Egypt, was actually raised in an Egyptian palace. So he actually understood the ways of Egypt. All of this I'm saying is in the Bible, right? He was raised in Pharaoh's palace and things like that. And so you already see that going on. But then if you fast forward to the New Testament, the story of the Jewish Messiah, who is Jesus, and who Christians believe is God come as a human being, right? The second person, we have this belief about God that he's one, but he's multiple. So one being, but three persons, which is not a contradiction, but we're not going into that. But that the second person there becomes a human being to save humanity, to save the people that he's trying to reach, right? He didn't come as an angel because he's not trying to save angels. Now, but in the story of Jesus, there was a persecution that was going on that was meant to, that, you know, there was a king that wanted to, was revealed to him that the Messiah had come, and that was going to be a threat to him because he thought he was going to be toppled. And so he ordered the slaughtering of babies. And so Jesus' parents, Joseph and Mary, in trying to escape that, because it was revealed to them, they fled to Egypt. They fled to Africa, you know. And then what Christians would say, part of how Jesus saves the world is that he takes the sin of the world on himself as on the cross of Calvary. But on the way to Calvary, after being tortured by the Roman soldiers, Jesus actually at some point couldn't carry the cross. He stumbled, and someone was told to help him. And the person that was told to help him is a guy called Simon, and in those days they called they call your name. You didn't really have a surname. The surname is really where you were from. And we're told he was from Cyrene. Now Cyrene, in those days, is the region that we would call in present day, if I'm not mistaken, is Libya, right? It's in that region, present day Libya. Yet Africa is that again. And then, if I go just one more step further, or two steps further actually, on the day the church was born, which we call Pentecost, the day that was born, Pentecost was a Jewish festival that had to be celebrated in Jerusalem. And so there are a number of these festivals that had to be celebrated. And so what happened was that the Jews at this time were spread all around the Roman Empire, but you did have some Jews that were home Jews, right? So, but a lot of diasporic Jews would come. So at this point, these diasporic Jews are already naturalized in different parts of the Roman Empire. And on the day that it was born, we're told straight up that some of the people that were present were Egyptians and Libyans. This is Acts chapter 2. And then finally, the first person recorded in the Bible that was a non-Jew, or not a Jew of mixed race. The Jews of mixed race were called Samaritans. But the very first convert that was recorded in the scriptures to Christianity that was not a Jew was an African. Now, it was written, they say the Ethiopian eunuch, but the Ethiopia was a catch-all phrase for brown-skinned people, much more accurate for what would have called Nubia at the time, which is in modern-day southern Sudan. And so I'm not even speaking of recorded history, and I can go into that if you guys have time, like the early church recorded history. But I'm just saying, from the sacred text of Christians, Africa has always been there. There's even in Acts chapter 13 that before the Apostle Paul goes out to the Apostle Paul is like the greatest missionary of Christianity in the first century, and before he's commissioned by his church to take the message of Christianity to the Roman Empire, part of the people that pray for him in his church, there's a guy called Niger, Niger, which, you know, I'm from Nigeria, so we have the River Niger, and that was a catch-all phrase. It's sort of the, you know, where we get the word Negro, nigger, right? And so obviously was an African, and there are many more of these kinds of stories. So that's just from a biblical standpoint. Now, that doesn't mean that was the church was already there. Now, if you then go out of biblical history, particularly, let me talk about the first 4 centuries, and this is the part that is actually missing from a lot of people's knowledge about Christianity, and then affects so many different things. But would you guys know that really the most influential part of Christianity in the first 4 centuries was not the Middle East? It certainly wasn't Europe. It was Africa. That was the center of Christianity. And so then maybe I'll tell you 2 stories and tell you two centers you should think about, 2 places you must think about, 2 cities. One, the ancient city of Alexandria, and 2, the ancient city of Carthage. So Alexandria is in Egypt. So we're talking northeast Africa with Egypt. So closer to present-day Israel, Jordan, and all of those places. But then you have Carthage, which is now, you know, sort of like suburb of the capital of Tunisia, which is Tunis. And if you check the map, you see there's a sort of like the horn where Tunis is, and it's very close to the Sicilian peninsula. So in other words, it's very close to Italy. Why is that important? Now, Alexandria, the 5 major cities of Christianity within the first, 3 centuries, 4 centuries were Jerusalem, of course, Rome, the seat of the Roman Empire, but then you had 3 other cities. Antioch, right? Antioch, representing what we call Asia, but that was more like Turkey. And then there was, I forget the last one. There's Alexandria, and the last one escapes me now. Constantinople. Did I say Antioch? Sorry, Anatolia. Anatolia in Turkey, and then Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. But I just want to talk about Alexandria and Carthage. So I didn't mention Carthage in this. We're really thinking about the first 2 centuries. These centers were so important. Alexandria was already a place of learning, and there's a famous library in Alexandria. But these places produced humongous, I can't overstate this, scholars of Christianity for the next 400 or 500 years. So, and the reason is this: Alexandria obviously is on the upper part of the Nile. But when you go down the Nile, there are lots of tributaries that go through the Nile into the inland parts of Egypt. Now, what happens is civilizations are formed there. And because civilizations are formed there, people are sailing in and around those places. A lot of commerce is going on there, but not just commerce. You also have ideas, the exchange of ideas. It's the same thing in the region of what we call the Maghreb. That goes through Algeria, Libya, Tunisia. And there's particularly in the Tunisian part, there's a river there called the Majerda, right? And as well, in the valleys and the mountains of Maghreb, you have people there. Now, these are inland rivers, not coastal rivers. Now, the reason I say that, because if you think of coastal rivers, it's very easy to say Christianity came from, other parts of the world and then came in, which is what we would say about the 18th century and 19th century European missionaries, but these are within. So 2 stories within those parts. Let's start with Carthage. Now, Carthage has produced some of the influential theologians of Christianity, particularly in the first millennium. So you think of a guy called Origins of Alexandria. You think of a guy called Tertullian. Tertullian was the first person that used the word Trinity written in Christian text. The first use of the word Trinity was in Tertullian's own writing, and he was a bishop in about the 2nd century. In the 3rd century, well, 2nd and 3rd century. In the 3rd century, you have a guy called Cyprian, and the 4th century, probably the most famous of all of those theologians, a guy called Augustine. Now, why Carthage is really important is because that's where the Latin-speaking part of Christianity really developed. And because it's close to Europe, actually, what we call Western Christianity today was mostly influenced by those guys from the Carthage region. So Augustine was in a place called Hippo that's in Algeria today. And so a lot of learning in the 4th century, Augustine was invited to speak in Milan, right? Origen, I think, was invited to speak in where was this? I forget that. But the one story I want to tell is this: the earliest Christian text written in Latin is about, and this is around it's about 180 AD or C, whichever one you use. It's about some guys called the Skeleton martyrs, 8 guys that were executed for their faith, and it's in a small town called Scylla. It's again near Carthage, Carthage, and those guys were executed for their faith in 118. That's the 2nd century. Now imagine this: for people to be executed for their faith, right? They've had time to actually imbibe that faith, right, and be so tied to the faith that must have been there for some time. And it must have spread around the region. So that's in the 2nd century. And then, as I said, the theologians that then were produced from that region. And so this nation that Christianity in Europe, it came from Europe to Africa. Actually, what you then see is the reverse. It was from Africa that it went to Europe. And speak to any serious Christian pastor or theologian in the West, Augustine is the most influential theologian of the first millennium for the Western Church. On the other side, which is the Egyptian side, you have the Coptic Church of Alexandria, which traces its history literally to probably the 50s, like 50 AD, right? With John Mark, who is written about, so 50s, 60s, right? Who's written about in the Bible. So he's like Apostle Peter's nephew, if I'm not mistaken, right? And the founding of the church there, and the early monastic movement, what you call monks and all of that, that was actually, it started from really about the 2nd century, 3rd century, with this movement called the Desert Fathers and the Mothers, who left the cities and went into what you call the wilderness, or what we call the desert there. And these are people who, a lot of people come from cities to come and see them. A lot of them live ascetic lives and things like that. This is what gave rise to it. Modern, the monasticism that came about later, first around in Africa and then traveled to Europe. But then down the line, Alexandria had affected, that was the seat of the northwestern Christianity, and that was much more Greek speaking. And so it affected a lot of the East. So like the Middle East, the Greeks, the Greek church, the Syrian church, and all of those. Now, take the Syrian church. There was a guy called Frumitius. Frumitius was a Syrian whose uncle and him got shipwrecked, and they were taken into Ethiopia. What we call Ethiopian today, but it was called the Aksum, the Kingdom of Aksum. This was the first major dynasty of where we call Ethiopia today. And they were captured, as slaves. Fast forward, in the time they were captured as slaves, because they were Christians, they started speaking the message of Christianity to a lot of the Ethiopians, such that a lot of them got converted. However, they'd already met some Christians there before they got there. And so they started converting the Christians until someone that they grew up with, a guy called Ezana, who was actually a prince, eventually became the king of Ethiopia, and he converted. And so as of the 4th century, that's the 300, the kingdom of Aksum officially took Christianity as its state religion. So much so that it became, he didn't, so just think about that. We often think that Christianity came to Africa because we were slaves. We actually had to take the message of the slave masters. But the reverse is the case. A slave that was not African actually came to Africa and actually gave us love. Well, at least started making it spread. And I'll end with this, just to show you the influence. I'll end with this part, because this is really important. Around this time that Ethiopia had become a Christian nation, not long around this time, there was something going on within the Roman Empire. Constantinople, which is named after the Emperor Constantine, Constantine had accepted Christianity and made Christianity the official, the official religion of the Roman Empire. I think this is like 325 AD. But the kind of Christianity that he accepted was something called Arianism. It was promoted by a bishop that was called Arian, a European bishop called Arian. And what he basically said at the time was that you got God the Father, and that Jesus, or the Son, is not actually God, that, he's a lesser kind of God. Now, for a lot of your audience, that may not matter much, but believe me, this was the biggest thing at the time. And religion and politics were often mixed together. It's not the way things are done in modern day political life. They were really merged together. So this was a big deal. And so Constantine was okay with allowing, both kinds to stay together. But his son, who became emperor after him, he was vociferous about pushing the Arian form of Christianity. So much so that the bishop of Alexandria, a guy called Athanasius, who rejected it vehemently, he eventually exiled him. He persecuted him. But the Ethiopians actually took the form of Christianity that said Jesus was God. So much so that the Fromitius guy then went to Alexandria to meet Athanasius and asked if he could make him a bishop, so that the Ethiopian the Christianity there can be authentically linked to an apostolic successor, which is Athanasius. And he does so. He makes him a bishop. And so the Ethiopian Christians actually accepted what we will call the Orthodox form of Christianity right now, today. And thereafter, when Constantine's son found out about that, Constantine's son basically threatened the king of Aksum and said they shouldn't accept that kind of Christianity. And he rejected it. Speak about Africans pushing away a European trying to say, tell us what to do. And they rejected it until today. The Ethiopian Christianity, which has existed, as I said, since the 4th century, and we all know Ethiopia is the only country that was never colonized, that was largely untouched. It wasn't affected by Europeans. So at the time when European Christianity was actually going in a heterodox way, African Christians, supported by an African bishop, was the one that was holding on orthodoxy. So I'll just end that. I can keep going on and on and on and on, but I'll just end that to just say Christianity has its roots in Africa. A lot of its roots. I'm not saying that the Asian part didn't play its role. They're wonderful, very important figures that have come out of there. And subsequently, in Europe as well, we've had other people that have come out. But the notion that this was brought to us, that you can't be authentically African if you accept Christianity, just doesn't square with history.
No, that was a lot of information in between that and pretty interesting. The things that you had mentioned, a lot of which I had not known, or just seeing the agents for African, like for example the Ethiopians, having that agency to decide, this is the form of Christianity we want to believe is really fascinating, and I hope I can do my due diligence and find the people that you mentioned and try to highlight them maybe in the description and also during the video. I don't know, Zengi, if you had any follow-up questions to that.
No. I it was just a good understanding of sort of the ancient African history. Now it's trying to do with Christianity, and especially the Axum. I think with Ethiopia, we have seen mentions of Ethiopia as probably the most sort of blatant example of Christianity predating colonialism as we know today. But yeah, so I think I think we can go to the next question, seeing as we ended on the sort of Ethiopian, the note of the Axum Empire getting sort of the credibility of being the era of Christianity in at least sub-Saharan Africa. We want to sort of see how Christianity in sort of the 20th century and how to be today. Why, like for example, I think I've got some stats here from Pew Research. So the struggle of Africa was around 1885, 84. So from the
1984 to 85.
Yes. So about around 20 years later, this research starts in the 1900s. And then the year 1900 to 2010. Traditional African religions this is sub-Saharan Africa. Traditional African religions were at 76%. Muslims were at 14%, and then Christianity was at 9%. However, by 1960, which is around the independence era, we can see that it's hovering, Christianity was now the second largest after traditional religions, at around 25%. Islam was following right behind around 24, 23. Traditional religions were still the majority, but now 57%. By now, I mean, this stands in 2010, so it could be higher or less. 57% of sub-Saharan Africans are Christian, 29% Muslim, and 13% believe in traditional religions. Now, why did we see such a rapid increase in Christianity at the time that colonialism was there? Because from what it shows here, that in the periods around the beginning of colonialism, Christianity was the minority. So could you just elaborate to us what your reflections are on colonialism's role in sort of the wholesale, large-scale Christianity? Because obviously, I mean, anyone who studies African, history, the first thing that you learn is, I don't know if they study that in Nigeria, but definitely in Southern Africa, is either there's 3 C's or the 3 G's, God, glory, and gold, I think, or the 3 C's, which is commerce, Christianity, and civilization. So can you explain to us this sort of understanding of colonialism's role in propelling Christianity in Africa?
No. So that's a bit of a complex question. I will try to answer it as simply, as briefly as I can, but it is really complex. So just give me a little bit of time and try. So it would take from the point that I was saying. Evidently, Christianity was a whole lot more within the Northern African sphere. And Northern African sphere was not, particularly relating with Sub-Saharan Africa as much. Don't forget that movements, the ability to access different places, affects how much we interact with each other. And so it wasn't that easy in terms of interaction as much. If you didn't have, large rivers that were connecting you and things like that. And so the spread of Christianity didn't happen as much from indigenous Africans down to Sub-Saharan Africa. That's just what we had. But on the other hand, it spread towards Europe. So, for instance, you take some of the monastic movements that happened within Egypt and and the other parts of Africa, then went to Europe, to Ireland and different parts of those places. And then there was massive evangelization. And so it started to grow in Europe. There was the conversion of the barbarians and things like that. And so as you fast forward, there's the split church between, there's a great schism in the 11th century between East and West of Christianity. And I'm not mentioning other parts of Christianity that, like that you had in India, Far India, and all of those things. We're not getting into those. But fast forward, Middle Ages, again, not as much going on in terms of relationships. Now, at this point as well, you do have the rise of Islam. And over a period of time, Islam itself starts to take over the north parts of Africa. Doesn't take over Ethiopia, doesn't get all the way there, but it starts to come down. And so this lack of interaction and globalization meant that there wasn't as much the exchange of ideas. Now, as I said, there was the Portuguese that then came between the 15th century to about the 17th century, about 17th, 18th, 17th century. That didn't, in terms of putting Christian base, it didn't put as much, and a lot of them didn't go as much into the inland areas. But around the 18th century, huge things were happening in Europe. This was the rise of not just the Reformation, which happened. The Reformation is what split Western Christianity into the Roman Catholicism and what you call the Protestant churches, the Reformed churches. And after the Reformed church, the Protestant Revolution, about 200 plus years, you started to have another kind of movement called the Great Awakening. So you've heard of figures like John Wesley, George Whitefield. But before that, there was also the German movement, the Moravians. And the Moravians then felt the impulse of evangelization beyond where they were. It wasn't a local evangelization, but it was let's go to the further parts of the world. So someone like George Whitefield eventually moves. He comes after the Moravians, and he goes to the United States. John Wesley is going all about around the whole of the United Kingdom, and there are lots of those movements. It's also the movement that eventually led to the abolishment of slavery, with someone like William Wilberforce, who had direct contact with John Wesley before he died. And so Christianity was really involved in abolishing slavery. And this was the impulse. Oh, go ahead.
So would you argue this sort of like this universalistic approach that that emanated from Germany, I believe, the Moravians, was sort of like to emancipate people, like a greater good type of notion?
Yeah, I would say, well, as Christians, we feel the first emancipation is a spiritual emancipation. And so it starts spiritually, but then it has social impact, right? So it can't, because Christians define a human being not just as an individual, but in relation to other people. We're social beings. And so what really happens to the person individually, for ill or for good, does eventually spread out to the society and then the culture. And so that's why, as many people were converted to Christianity during the time of the Great Awakening in England and so forth, social issues had to start coming, things had to start being challenged in that way. And so eventually there are missionary societies that were being formed, and they wanted to reach what they would call the heathen. And heathen was a word that would be used for Christians. The problem, though, was that it's well used simply in a spiritual way. It's a factual term, right? It's just a descriptive term. So it's like me saying, well, you guys are Zambians and you're not Nigerians, and maybe I want to persuade you to become a Nigerian, to have dual citizenship, right? So it's just stating something about where you are. And so when you think about heathen that way, okay, it's fine. These are people that don't believe in God the way we do believe in God. The problem, though, is that for some missionaries, and you mentioned the three C's, the heathen weren't just seen from the spiritual condition. They were seen from the economic condition, and they was also seen from their civilization condition. And so the three C's was a form of, a way of thinking about liberation of the people of Africa. Now, but at the same time, the governments themselves started to realize, so you mentioned the scramble for Africa, started to realize that there were loads of resources in Africa. And so there was a sort of uneasy dance between the government and the missionaries. A lot of the missionaries wanted to use the opportunities that was given to them to be able to reach the people. The government wanted to come on the back of those. Some of the missionaries knew exactly what was going on, but for them it was like, well, it's like Soviet. Yes, yeah, like Livingston. But Livingston was less. His motives were less pure, I would say. At least that's the way the record looks at it. Well, you had a lot more genuine ones. But the problem is that a lot of us were enculturated beings, right? Our ideologies, our beliefs are still formed within certain cultures. And so I'm saying there are positive, really a lot of positive impact of the missionaries that came within the colonial era. Like they helped us, they improved our health care, like the mortality rate, oh my gosh, before they came was dreadful. There are certain things socially that were social norms that I would say terrible, egregious, superstitious norms. I don't know if you guys know, but Nigeria, especially in my tribe, we are known for, we have the highest concentration of twins in the world. We produce the most number of twins in the world, right? And other tribes in Nigeria are also very good. There's a tribe called the Efiks around the Calabar area, and they literally, when you had twins, they thought it was a bad omen from the gods, and so they would always drown one of the other twins in the river. And the famous missionary called Mary Slessor, I think she was from Scotland, and through a lot of her work, that was banished. So, we can't just say, well, it's more complex to just say, well, they just came to change our cultures and look down on that. No, they came with a lot of good things, and I would do, even then as a Christian, to say that, well, the message that eventually transformed you spiritually, that gives you stability in this world spiritually, but also promises you eternity, was a blissful future. They brought that as well. Having said that, there were negative impacts, a lot of negative impact. First of all, you should think about it from the government part. The government were just not. It was about expanding the empire, but also enriching the empire. Do you know how many Africans fought in the First World War and Second World War? Hardly a monument actually given to a lot of them that died. That was the problem, right? They were recruited from Nigeria, recruited from various parts of the world, and they're not actually. If you go that way, I think I visited in London, where you have the cenotaph and some of these monuments there. They're not mentioned. Their names aren't mentioned. The countries are not even acknowledged. Right, they exacted certain imperial taxes upon us and things like that, right? And a lot of them came in because a lot of the people accepted the missionaries, right? And so there's problems with that. There's also, I think for me, the biggest impact on this is two things that I related. It was the entrenching of the superiority of the European culture, quote-unquote civilization, and also entrenching the idea of the inferiority of the African cultures. And so, first of all, there's a sort of dismissiveness of our way of life. Because they believed they had a superior, or let's just say a better, spiritual message, they also believed that their civilization and their culture was also superior, and implicitly that the European is also above the African. Now, it's not said, that's why I said it's implicit, but this is anti-Christian, because even whether you're a Christian or not, the Bible says that all human beings are created in the image of God, which means we all have equal worth before God. So no one, even when you believe in that God, you can't say that you're above the other one. Now, you can say that, hey, here's a message that leads you and makes you wiser for salvation to God, but it doesn't make you actually better. But this is kind of thing that happened. And so they dismissed a lot of our cultural norms. And the cultural norms were, at least I can speak with the Yoruba religion and the other ones, but it was, you had the religion at the center, but you had a civilization formed around it, a civilization that had, implications for what it means to have a family. We had a system for what we do at birth, how people died, the afterworld, how you appease the gods, how we deal with our vocation, and all of those things. Now, as a Christian, I do believe that the religious system itself, I don't believe it's true. I do think that Christianity makes a compelling case, and I'm not converting to that just because a European brought it. That's why I've brought it to our continent. I've already said that Christianity actually had its seedbed. European Christianity had its seedbed in Africa. So that is an issue of truth. It's an issue of worldview, and that's not the preserve of any earnest. However, I do want to say that because, as the Bible tells us, that God has revealed himself in some ways in all places, right? But we'll say especially in Christianity, in all places, there's a sense of God around, that you would actually find civilizations in different places. We had the Benin Kingdom, for instance, here, which was one of the most sophisticated kingdoms that you find from the 13th and 14th century. There was the Great Wall of Benin, I think probably even before the Great Wall of China. So to come in and just look at the people that say they're heathen because they don't have the message of Christianity, and think that all the practices there that they have weren't actually, it wasn't high culture. There was a certain level of dismissiveness that they came with. And so when they were introducing Christianity, rather than understand our cultures better and then see how you integrate Christianity within the system of that culture and delineate between what is European culture and the pure gospel message, there wasn't a lot of that. And so there are things that they could have kept, which we've recovered now. So for instance, the way we did our marriages, they told them not only if you're a Christian, you cannot have those traditional marriages, right? That's a problem, right? The traditional marriages were family affairs, and it held the society together. The way we did our naming ceremonies, they said, well, you can't do those. You either choose baptism of your children or the traditional naming ceremonies. And there are ways you could change that now. A lot of that we've also recovered. It was the same thing with our names as well. They said you cannot have those indigenous names. You should have Christian names. There is no such thing as Christian names. Christian names, you have, it was European names. But now you can have names with Christian meaning, but can have African languages. And so those are some of the effects. Maybe I'll just finish with this. What that has entrenched in us is this sort of, I don't even think we're finally coming from that. And I've had to even deal with some of these in my own. I spent about almost 8 years in Europe living there. But I'd been when I was younger, traveling for holiday and things like that. I wouldn't lie to you. I grew up thinking white was right. There was this British television series. It was called Robin Hood. It was in the early 80s when I was growing up. And there was the guy that played Robin Hood was a guy called Michael Praed. And I just remembered his long hair. And I always just wanted to have long hair. I remember when David Beckham came on the scene, I always wanted to have hair like David Beckham. And what do we use? Both our women now wear the long wig and things like that, flowy hair. What do we use to make our hair like the European people's hair? We use something called a relaxer. Now think about that name, a relaxer. Our hair, our natural hair, needs to be relaxed. Why? Because that's telling you that naturally we're almost savage-like, and we have to be relaxed. We're even speaking about this biologically, not even just sociologically. And so the kind of damage that this has done, where we've forgotten about our history, we're not even looking to the history of Christianity in Africa. We look to the white man in some ways to come and save us. We reference best practices in our organizations based on what is done in the West. We always look to the West for some kind of validation. And I think these are some of the sociological, cultural effects that have happened when Christianity came in, not just as this spiritual thing that needed to find its way enculturated in our systems, but came as a civilizing project as well as a commercializing project. So, as I said, it's a bit more complex, but that's what I can say about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know what you think, Nathan, but I mean, if I could just weigh in, I think it's very, very insightful because you've sort of considered sort of the interaction between the missionaries who, from their perspective, believe they're doing something good, and then sort of the way in which the government and political and commercial system use that almost as a glove in which to perpetuate colonization. So just, I mean, I do wonder then now if Christianity would be as big as it is now had they not been the full backing of European governments and economic appetite. If the missionaries were simply on their own, would we have had the Christianity, one, as prevalent as it is now, and two, as you said, as European in terms of our understanding of it in its large scale as it is now? Would we have had a more Africanized Christianity had it not been for full scale, if say the Christianity was done through a missionary going to a kingdom, the Asante kingdom, or going to the Zulu kingdom, and colonization never happened. And they're just like, oh yeah, okay. Shaka Zulu was like, yeah, you guys, if you want to convert, cool, I'm good, fine. Yeah. So just like if you could give us like a quick answer to that. If colonialization did not happen through government and commercial means, and missionaries were just simply allowed to interact, and it was a good little cultural exchange, would we have had Christianity to the extent that it is now, and would we have had a more Africanized type of Christianity?
My answer to that actually is Christianity didn't grow and explode the way it is because of the missionaries. Actually, it actually exploded because, in fact, let me put it another way. The way the Europeans, the European form of Christianity that eventually came in sub-Saharan Africa, if that continued to be practiced, Christianity would be dying. Like, that form is already dying. And this leads to another thing that used to happen at, in those times. Because what would happen, even a lot of the people who were Christians, who converted as Christians, Africans that converted as Christians, you have to actually question their authenticity when they came. Because what they saw was that, hey, these guys are bringing education. The formal education was actually a good thing in some parts of it, even though some of that was teaching about empire and stuff like that. But, math is math. It's whether you're European or, and in fact, math didn't even originate with the Europeans. So that's another question entirely. At least the numbering system is Arabian. But if you remove that, I would say the education, the healthcare, all of those things were important. And so a lot of Africans didn't really like them, but they liked what they brought. And so they converted because of that. But once they got what they wanted, they were still practicing their traditional religions and stuff like that. What made the difference was when Africans started to own Christianity in the way Africans wanted to practice. And so this gave rise to what we call the African independent churches. Now, here's how you know part of the problem, some of the prejudices that were existed. A lot of prejudices that happen even today, you see this all over the world. They say there's nothing that maybe a Westerner hates more than a black man who actually knows onions, or a black man that's full of confidence. This started happening within Christianity first, because what you'd often have is there would be these missionary churches, and then within those missionary churches, you'd have a guy who probably has his own encounter, revelation with God, and starts to do his thing. He gets a bit powerful. They try to stop him within the church setting. He actually doesn't relent. He's kicked out, and then he starts his church. Now his church still having forms of Christianity, but actually much more enculturated in the way people would understand, and maybe sometimes not always orthodox. But what happened was people started flocking towards those churches, and they were having much more, if you like, and I don't know what you guys think about this, but I'll just put my own cards on the table. I think one of the things that Christianity brings is to look at the human being as a whole person, and so that is formation intellectually. That's thinking about the mind. It's formation vocationally. That's thinking about our hands. It's formation emotionally, our inspiration and thinking about our feelings, but it's also formation spiritually. And so encounters with the divine, many of those guys were actually seen supernatural things happen. In fact, they were having more of that than the intellectual part because they weren't as formed. And so with the Africans who are very, very spiritually aware and very, very in touch with the spiritual world, when they see that happening, they were able to give up what we would call idols much faster than somebody who is coming with a rationalistic, systematic approach to it. In Nigeria, we have something called power past power. That is, there are powers and there are greater powers. And so a lot of people actually started converting as a result of those things. And so it was the owning of the Christianity in an African way that actually made it explode. And later, the latter part, well, not even the latter part, the mid part of the 20th century, that's when we started to see an explosion of what you call Pentecostalism. But it was first indigenous Pentecostalism. This even rose. This rose in the. So a quick one. There's a movement here in Nigeria. They're called the Aladuras. The Aladura just means praying people in Yoruba. Praying people. Why did that movement take off? And this is in the mid 1910s to around 1920. Why did it take off? I'll tell you. It was the first pandemic that we had in the 20th century. It was the Spanish flu. And the Spanish flu was ravaging Europe, but eventually came to Africa. Right? Ravaging through, and, just like this last one, there was no cure for it. People were just dying. And we didn't have a lot of medical, help. And even the guys that did have medical advancement, they didn't know what to do with it in Europe. And so literally all we had, people were literally living on a prayer, as Bon Jovi says, right? And these movements, when people were seeing people being healed by these group of people, Adura in Yoruba is prayer. So Aladuras are praying people. And that's how, the movement was born. And it brought a lot of converts. In the 30s and 40s, we had a guy who was part of the Pentecostal Apostolic Church that come from Britain. And also, Britain, I think, not the... And, they set up in their European ways and all that. It was a little bit more supernatural. But there was a guy within that, an uneducated guy called Joseph Babalola. And he just started having encounters with God and things like that. It was very, very miraculous. And that gave rise to, he was in the Apostolic Church. That was European. But then he started something called the Christian Apostolic Church, CAC. There was TAC, CAC. CAC is 100 times bigger till today than the TAC. So what I'm saying is that the explosion of Christianity, actually, in the latter part of the 20th century, is, I would say, a reaffirmation of our Africanness in Christianity. It was almost a re-owning of it. Now, it has problems. I'm not going to say it doesn't have problems. In many ways, you have personalities over the church. You have, the prosperity gospel, the extremes of that, where with scams and fake miracles, and some pastors just trying to line their pockets. They are the extremes of that, and I'm not denying that. But I think sometimes they're all lumped up together as the wrong thing. And I'll say that it has been one of the best things that has happened for us to re-own our African identity and take control of the Christianity that was already here years before. So yes, I would disagree that that it was the colonial, the missionary era that enabled the explosion of Christianity. I would say in sub-Saharan Africa, it started to bring more of the introduction, right, to it, but it only really grew and exploded because the Africans started re-owning that Christianity.
So that's very interesting. I think just because you're listening, because I think it's very these are things that I think nobody. I mean, we personally, I haven't encountered anyone that spoke about it like that, because you generally have this idea where Christianity came in, colonialism, and simply exploded simply because people were told this is what you're supposed to believe, and you're supposed to reject for your previous religion. I sort of have two questions in a way. So my first one is because over here we really plan. Our goal is also to highlight African scholars and also people who are influential in that way. Because I think you mentioned. I think for me personally, when it comes to people that were influential with Christianity in Africa, the number one name in Zambia that pops up is David Livingstone. So my question would be: do you know any key indigenous African people that you would say were very influential in the spread of Christianity?
Yeah, I would say definitely. I mentioned because all the guys of the earlier
Sorry, I think you mentioned Joseph Babalola.
Joseph Babalola. So if you're thinking later times, but I would even say before Joseph Babalola, again as a Nigerian, there was a guy called Bishop Ajayi Crowther. I've forgotten his Christian name. I don't know. Samuel Ajayi Crowther, who was captured as a slave, that was being taken to Europe, but then for some reason eventually landed in Freetown, Sierra Leone. And then in Sierra Leone he was educated at Faro Bay College. I don't know if you know Faro Bay College, which is the first Faro Bay College was the first, I think, secondary school in, if I'm not mistaken, probably indigenous secondary school, not just in West Africa, probably West Africa, but it probably was in Africa, I'm not sure. And you know what? Freetown was created as a place for freed slaves to start. It was an experiment of actually having an African city with free slaves and things like that. So he was educated there, and he was really brilliant. And then he went for education in England, and he then had a mission to be able to come back and re-evangelize the people of West Africa. And he was the one that translated the Yoruba, the Bible into Yoruba. And then he was eventually consecrated as a bishop, and the first Anglican bishop in Africa. He's a colossus, basically, a colossus in this part. And a lot of Africans still celebrate him as well. So you've got people like that. It was like 19th century. You've got, this is much more recent. The Anglican, obviously, Desmond Tutu. That's a really important figure. Then there is the guy, Festo Kivengere, who was also someone that stood up to Idi Amin, who was eventually executed by Idi Amin. A really, really important guy. And let's see who else.
I think that was Archbishop Luwum, the Anglican bishop that killed Idi Amin.
Yeah, that he was, but so was Festo Kivengere.
Oh, right.
So we are referring to, he was the full archbishop, but I don't think Festo Kivengere was an archbishop, if I'm not mistaken. And so, there are lots of people, I would say, doing great things. I would say even now, if you look in the Pentecostal circles, just in terms of the church, Ndeko Mensah, Otabil, and what you've had with Pentecostal churches, particularly from the 90s, is they've been able to, not all the best, but they've been able to, and not all of them are the best, but what it's responding to is the urbanization of Africa. And that's another thing, that's another story of the 20th century, how from 1900, 10% of the world lived in cities. And as of 2050, it's projected to be 75%. I think we're probably about 67%. And that was a big thing in Africa as well. And so by the time you get to the early 80s, I can think about the city, Lagos, a lot of the older churches, the Anglican Methodist churches, weren't thinking well enough about vocation and the challenge of the appetite that had been created by westernized urbanization of a lot of our cities. Whereas the Pentecostal churches were, so the rise of a lot of these mega churches, some of them, why they actually were appealing to middle-class people was they were giving the inspiration that was needed in tough economies to actually go and work. On Sundays, you get the inspiration you needed to that fueled you to work on Monday to Friday, but a lot of them were actually doing vocational skill training and things like that. There was a push of entrepreneurship and all of those things. And I think they get a lot of bad rap, and rightly so in some ways, but actually the value that they have actually brought to the African continent is actually not spoken about enough. And so these will be practitioners. I've spoken about a little bit of some theologians and some new theologians all around, some of them I'll read the book here and there, but I don't remember the name. But yeah, I do think we have a lot of heritage that is there. People are right. Part of the problem we do have is publishing. It's not a very easy thing. And when I mean publishing, well, maybe it's not publishing. It's a problem that always plagued Africa, which is the connection of the African countries now. But even then, the kingdoms, there's a lot of divide and conquer. So, for instance, if I wanted to go to Kenya, I have to get a visa. If I want to go to South Africa, I have to get a visa. It's easier for me to get a visa to the UK sometimes, at least in my case, than, sometimes other African countries. And because of that, the exchange of ideas don't happen. And because of that, if I'm publishing here, I'm really just publishing in Nigeria. It doesn't get to other African countries. And so now what happens is European publishing houses have to publish, and then I buy African authors from European publishing houses. So we don't even know even the many guys that are doing a lot of great work if you're not actually traveling around, so that's a challenge.
Yeah, and I suppose even the language barrier, getting to speak to the sort of Lusophone, Spanish-speaking, Arabic-speaking Africans. But I
just had one last final question for...
I'll ask after.
Yeah, sure thing. So, I mean, from what I'm hearing, the way you've detailed, at least a brief part of the church history or Christianity within Africa, it seems to me like there's a lot of positives and there is a lot of negatives that come with it. And I think the negative, as you've elaborated, sort of come from the messenger and not necessarily the message itself. And my question would be, how do you have any advice, if any, for how people can sort of deal with those two different things? Because I think from my understanding now, it seems like people who gravitate towards this idea that Christianity is an offshoot of colonialism sort of are not able to let go, or should I say are still dealing with maybe the emotional things that missionaries had done and other Europeans had done, and sort of tied it to Christianity and are unable to deal with that. But how would you advise Africans deal with that sort of complex history that's there, because there's a lot of good that comes from it, but then it seems like the bad is what mostly highlight that.
Well, yeah. So I would say people can come from you can come from different angles on this. It depends on the person. One of my favorite passages of scripture is taken from the book, the Psalms, and I say it's one of my favorite because it's actually a motivating passage for me in the Psalms, and it says it's from Psalm 68 verse 31 for those who are able to read the Bible. But it says, "Envoys will come from Egypt, Cush will submit herself to God." I love that passage because it's a passage that's basically saying, at the end of what we'll call human history, that in where, the mythical Jerusalem, where we'll be gathered with God, that you would see African representatives there bringing their offering to God. And when it says that they'll come, it basically means that they'll come with unique African products that are offerings to God, that they'll come with unique African products. So Egypt, we know. Cush, which is closer to the Horn of, probably more closer to Somalia and those kind of places. In other words, that the hope of Christianity is that all nations will be gathered into God in their own unique ways. And so for me, that brings two things together. not necessarily in the same order, but two things. That I am passionate about Christianity, but I'm also passionate about my Africanness. And I'm doing that not in a way that is contradictory. I'm doing that in a way that my religion necessitates that I integrate them. That God created Africa for Africans. And God wanted Africans to worship him through Jesus Christ, like he wants all people to worship him through Jesus Christ. But he doesn't want that to happen without our Africanness. So the first thing I would say to some people who are questioning is, one, read the Bible, honestly, right? Don't first take how people have practiced it, and I would say some abuses, which I verily acknowledge. But actually first see that does the sacred text of the religion demand that you choose between being an African and being a Christian? That's number one. I don't think it does that. I think it gives dignity. If I'm just being honest, it gives dignity to our ethnicities. And I'm saying that as an African, I think a European should also find dignity in their Europeanness. I think an Asian should find dignity in their Asianness. So that's number one. Number two, I would say is test that, again, as an African, by looking at the immediate history of the church in Africa, right? Like some of the things I've said. And I'll say, look, there's a lot of material out there, right? You can read a book that really helped me in this, is How Africa Shaped the Christian Mind, by a guy called Thomas Oden, right? Whose Religion Is It Anyway, by Lamin Sane, a late Ghanaian, Gambian theologian. And there's a series of books by, what's his name? The missiologist Andrew Walls. Andrew Walls. He served as principal of Arabic College. He lectured in the University of Nigeria at Nsukka. He's an absolute scholar in understanding how Christianity had worked in Nigeria. So if you want to go a bit deeper, you'd be able to just see and test historical Christianity right from the beginning up until the present day, and you see the role that Africans played. In fact, I would even argue, I met a scholar, an American scholar, that told me that he actually traced that the first missionaries that came to Nigeria and Lagos were African Americans, right? And so that's a whole another story, that the guys who came to Freetown were actually African Americans that came, and that's why Liberia itself was an American colony, but it was really a place for freed American slaves. So there's a whole load of, even just being a black person, that Christianity, a lot of the prejudices that we see now are not necessarily, in fact, I would say unnecessary. They're an abuse of Christianity. But within Christianity itself, it has the resources to challenge those abuses, just like it did with slavery, chattel slavery, and actually show that those things are true. So if you investigate the Bible objectively, look at history properly, and then ask yourself the question, do I need to choose? Now, you may then say, and I'm not sure Christianity is true, and that's another question I would say. But don't say Christianity is not true just on the basis of the fact that it doesn't agree with my ethnicity. I don't think that's right. But then you can investigate whether Christianity is true, and that's another question, I would say.
Yeah. So just as a last question, so this is going to be quite a controversial question, because I think it's probably one of these topics that are hotly debated, and that's why we decided to have this discussion. In the same fashion that Christianity has been present in Africa prior to colonization, and sort of Africans have had to reclaim and re-own Christianity. Those who are not Christian, for example, those who don't believe in Christianity, in present day systems, obviously, you have had situations in Uganda where there's a lot of pressure from Western countries to accept issues like lesbian and gay rights. In South Africa, it's legal. It's very. In South Africa, it's legal. Mauritius is legal. Uganda is a different situation. I understand in America, it's also. In Nigeria, it's also illegal. And Christianity has sort of been attributed to be the main source of this lack of acceptance of these people. Opposition, yes. And often people argue that, oh no, Christianity is a colonial system and it's a relic, and you're arguing based on Western systems. And we have just established that, Christianity has been there prior to colonization. But there's also evidence of these practices, homosexual practices prior to colonization. So to what extent then, how can Christianity sort of argue its way through this in sort of a rational manner in debating the ownership of Christianity, but at the same time, the evolution of our sort of traditional practices and owning what we had prior to colonization? What's the...
that's
I'm not asking you to make an unofficial statement or anything. This is your personal...
you're
not contradictory.
No, thank you. Well, let me first say, I've really enjoyed this conversation because, I maybe I should go and listen to a few more of your podcasts, because I think you guys are asking very relevant questions, and I think isn't often, this kind of space of discussing complex matters, but actually in a less culturally heated manner. I've not seen that often in the African continent, and I think we need more of this. So kudos to you guys. And I said that because you've not asked me any simple question today. So let me take a stab at this. This is a really, really important question, but I would like to challenge some different things. So the first thing I would say is that at this point, we're not just dealing with an issue of morality. We're dealing with issues of cultural norms, historical cultural norms, and you're also dealing with the establishment or how do you establish a nation state. So you're dealing with the issue of geopolitics as well, right? Cultural geopolitics, if you like. And so how are laws formed within a society? I think laws come from cultural norms. But cultural norms come from, religious moral norms. That's usually the order. And so laws are at this point, but the laws usually are reflections of cultural norms that are already accepted. And a lot of those cultural norms that are accepted come from your religion. Even if your religion is not an established religion. And so when I look around the world, Europe that I lived in for a while, the United States that I have quite a lot of friends there, I've traveled there regularly. There is no law that is used in a country, that is established in any country, that is not rooted in something deeper than the laws. And so the next thing I would ask is, when other people are trying to evaluate the laws that nation states have taken from themselves, the first thing you have to do, and I'm saying as a Christian, and this is where sometimes the Christian evangelization hasn't always done well. The first thing you have to do is respect. It's respect. The Christian faith teaches that probably the three most important things that we need for human relationships to flourish, because we'll always disagree, is love, respect, and humility. Love, respect, and humility. Those three things are important. That's why for husband and wife, it says that husbands love your wives, wives respect your husbands, and vice versa. Because those things are important. You will disagree, but you can have unity. Unity doesn't always come with unity of norms or ideas, but unity comes in how we relate with each other, and that is built on humility, love, and respect. So I don't go into. I have my views about laws in the United States and laws in Europe and things like that in terms of evaluating them from my Christian morality. But I don't go there and think, well, I know some Christians do that. Like, you guys are going to hell in a handbasket and things like that. I can engage with people there and say, tell me why you believe this and do you see that there's a problem here? But I come with respect. But I don't think that as a visitor, I'm necessarily going to change everything. So when we examine, as you said, some of the pressure that comes from outside of Africa, I think part of the problem has been, we see this, we felt a huge lack of respect for our norms. You also saw that, not just in Africa, I don't know if you watched the last World Cup, and a lot of the media, the Western media coverage of things that are going on in Qatar and things like that. Now, you may disagree, but you should also respect, because Qataris are not coming to Europe when they are hosting your World Cup and telling you exactly how you should behave. So that's number one. Number two is this. I would challenge the view. I think sometimes this is a sort of argumentative fallacy that is actually done. Yes, there are some places in Southern Africa where homosexuality, historically, and you want to question how long that history has been practiced and accepted. But I challenge anyone to show me that historically that is the majority of the case in a lot of the African traditions. So whilst it's very difficult to speak of Africa as a whole, I would say that sometimes you have to take each ethnicity and ask yourself, within most of the ethnicities, is it always been like maybe half-half? Some people accept homosexual practice and some maybe 50-50, some reject it. I don't think that's the case. I think a lot of even the traditional African religions are firmly rooted in understanding sex and gender, first identifying the individual with their sex and gender, and that is very related to how those individuals sexually relate with themselves, which is the evidence for them of what is right is the ability by design to produce children. That's why families are so huge for Africans. So if you start from the standpoint that families are so huge for Africans, and how families grown, they're grown through the sexual union that produces them, and since homosexual activity cannot produce them, many Africans will reject it as not normal. Now, I know that can be very offensive to some people, but that's what we believe. Now, you'd have to argue your case, especially when we're talking objectively, for why you believe otherwise. But I don't think, sometimes it's almost like, well, this is the 21st century, and therefore, people don't believe that. Well, the majority of the world still don't believe in that. And a lot of the European and Western societies actually just came to that. So what was happening? Were they backward when they didn't? So that's number two. So I'm saying that African religions in general, African systems in general, have not actually had that. Then the third thing I would say is, well, we are at a time when Christianity and Islam are the dominant religions in Africa. Therefore, you do expect that Christian morality and Islamic morality and the understanding, and morality comes from a worldview where you have, worldviews are formed with four things: origin, destiny, meaning, and morality. But meaning and morality in the middle are determined by what you consider as the origins and the destiny of individuals. Now, within Christianity and Islam, with their own definition, morality has come out to say, we've produced morality that says, this is how men and women are meant to relate, this is how men and men are meant to relate, and this is how women and women are meant to relate. And because the vast majority of our legislators, right, and people in our judiciary subscribe to those religions, of course, as a whole, and most of the people also subscribe to those religions, of course, as a whole, you expect that the societies are going to be like that. Now, in 50 years' time, maybe secularization, like happened in Europe, would also happen in Africa, and things could be changed. It's very possible. And so that leads me to my last point. My last point on that is, as Christians, I don't believe that this world is all that there is. So I don't fight for this world as though I fight for this world as though it matters, because I do believe that God is going to renew the world, that this world is beautiful, but it's broken. And what Jesus promises us is that he's going to take away the brokenness and eventually give us something that is beautiful at the end of time. And so because he's going to do that, I know this world matters. And so I fight for justice. I fight for beautifying the world in its brokenness. But I also know that ultimately it's God to do that. And so that has a way of limiting how I fight for things. I'm not going to fight for my morality in a way that could make me vehemently against opposing a particular person. I care that person sees that I'm loving towards them. And so if you're asking me personally, I have had trouble sometimes with some of the laws that were enacted in some African countries where I felt that it went beyond. I think we can condemn and say this is not morally what we stand for, but I think sometimes the criminalization of even the association of some of those people, I felt as a Christian who actually believes in the morality of heterosexual activity over that of homosexual activity. I do think that it didn't come out in the loving way that I would like to. And I do also think sometimes Christian evangelization has now focused on changing people's morality instead of bringing them to God. I think a relationship with God should then lead people to changing of how they behave. But if you try to evangelize people with changing how they behave, then you may end up losing them not having a relationship with God. And so those are the 4 things I would say about that.
Well, that was well put together. Thank you. Yeah, on the PowerPoint.
Yeah, no, it's very, very interesting. Sort of the cross section of how you analyze. I mean, I feel like we've touched on so many different heated debates that in and of themselves they're episodes. And so, yeah, no, I mean, it's been incredibly insightful. That I think, this is one of those big episodes, you know. And I'm sure we have quite a lot of respondents. The conversation will keep on going.
Yeah, that's I definitely agree. I think there's a lot that I've learned from this episode that I think I'll be doing about in the beginning, and yeah, I mean, you can just tell how really enjoying the conversation and what we're talking about, because I think we're planning the 45 minutes recording it now.
Yeah, how long have it been? Yeah.
I mean, we're coming to an hour and a half, so now this was really, oh wow. Yeah. Very, very insightful. So I just want to say thank you very much, Pastor Femi, for joining us, and then hopefully we can collaborate again on maybe some other topics. But yeah, on behalf of the Dummy Squad and all of the people that listen in, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. I really had fun. Honestly, I didn't know it was an hour and a half. And so I'm really, really, really grateful for what you guys are doing. I know it's, as you guys said, off the before we started recording, you know, not been as regular as you want to, but I do hope that you can be really regular, because I do think that we do need a little bit more of this, and also I would say for people your age, that it's important that it's you guys at your age doing this, because of the audience that you can reach. So well done. And if you guys will have me on another time, I'll be glad to. If we can make it work, I'll definitely be glad to do that.
Yeah, thank you very much, and see you guys on the next episode.
I am an African.